The ink wasn't even dry on the briefing before the first birds were in the air. That's how it started. Not with a roar of a nation, but with the scratching of a pen in a silent Oval Office. President Elias Thorne didn't call a press conference. He didn't ask for a vote. He didn't even look at the Constitution gathering dust in its glass case at the National Archives. He simply looked at a map of a world he didn't like and decided it needed to change. For decades, we talked about checks and balances like they were physical walls. We found out they were just polite suggestions. Thorne began using the judicial branch like a personal shield, issuing executive orders that bypassed every failsafe we thought we had. He sent the army into sovereign lands, claiming imminent threat where there was only dissent. The world watched, and for a while, the world was quiet. But silence isn't always submission. Silence is just the sound of people holding their breath while they sharpen their blades. It'll by the third month of the unilateral strikes. The atmosphere in the UN General Assembly had shifted from outrage to a chilling professional coldness. The American envoy would stand up to speak, and the room would go dead. No boos, no walkouts. Just thousands of eyes watching a ghost. Behind the scenes, the cables were humming, not through official channels. Those were tapped by the NSA within seconds, but through runners. Hand-delivered notes and encrypted frequencies the president's tech surgeons hadn't mapped yet. The world's leaders weren't just angry, they were terrified. A superpower with no leash is a predator that eventually eats everything. They realized then that diplomacy was a dead language. If they wanted to survive the American president, they had to stop being nations. They had to become a ghost. High in the Swiss Alps, inside a bunker built to withstand the very missiles Thorne was currently fond of launching, the secret summit took place. There were no flags in that room, no nameplates. The leaders of the G20 sat in a circle, stripped of their titles, acting only as a collective body of survival. The consensus was reached in less than an hour. America's military might was too vast for a conventional war. Couldn't beat the US in a fair fight, so they decided not to give them one. It would strike the eyes, the ears, and the heels of the giant. They called it the Black Flag Protocol. No country would claim credit. No nation would risk the president's nuclear temper. They would create a phantom anemia, nation of justice, and they would build it in the shadows of the deep sea. The logistics were staggering. For the next 6 months, the world's industrial powers went into a quiet, focused overtime. Shipyards in Asia, tech hubs in Europe, and steel mills in South America worked on a single, unified design. They built a fleet of stealth submarines and high-altitude bombers that shared no DNA with existing military tech. Everything was painted a matte, light-absorbing black. The banners were printed in secret for world justice. White text on a void. It was a brand for a revolution. They weren't just building a military. They were building an inevitability. They knew the American Navy was the pride of the world, a blue-water force that couldn't be touched. So, they decided the American Navy would never even get the chance to leave its porch. It was a Tuesday. It's always a Tuesday. At 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The first of the Black Fleet's stealth subs sat 5 miles off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. Hid in the San Diego fog, another dozen were submerged, their sonar baffles silent. In Pearl Harbor, the water was as still as a mirror. The American sailors on watch saw nothing on their radar. The satellites, supposedly the eyes in the sky, had been hit by a coordinated, high-altitude burst of electromagnetic interference launched from a civilian freighter in the mid-Atlantic hours earlier. For the first time since the Civil War, the American coast was truly terrifyingly dark. The president was asleep in the White House, dreaming of his next conquest, while 5 miles away, the ghost Salvo was being loaded into the tubes. The strike didn't sound like a war. It sounded like a series of heavy doors slamming shut across the continent. At 3:12 a.m., the ghost Salvo left the tubes of the submerged Black Fleet. These weren't traditional cruise missiles. They were low-altitude, high-velocity darts that hugged the whitecaps of the Atlantic and Pacific. In Norfolk, the sailors on the watch of the USS Gerald or Ford didn't even have time to sound general quarters. A single, focused kinetic strike hit the main dry dock gates. Then another hit the fuel farm. In San Diego, the story was the same. The Black Flag Nation was uninterested in sinking the ships at sea. They wanted to entomb them in their own harbors. By 3:30 a.m., the most powerful navy in human history was a collection of floating targets, trapped behind walls of twisted steel and burning oil. While the navy was being crippled in the surf, the sky was being stolen. Across the heartland, from Nellis in Nevada to Andrews in Maryland, the blindout began. It wasn't a bomb that did the most damage. It was a line of code. A global consortium of hackers, backed by the unified resources of the world's remaining tech giants, triggered a logic bomb embedded in the GPS satellite architecture years prior. Every American pilot who scrambled to their cockpit found a dead glass display. The fly-by-wire system screamed system failure. On the ground, the fortified air defenses, the Patriot batteries, and the THAAD units began to spin aimlessly. Their brains had been wiped. The Iron Dome of America didn't just break, forgot how to think. President Thorne was shaken awake by a Secret Service agent whose face was the color of ash. "Sir, we have a situation." In the Situation Room, the big board, the glowing map of American global dominance was flickering. One by one, the green icons representing carrier strike groups and air wings were turning gray. Thorne demanded a satellite feed. "Give me a visual on Norfolk," he barked. The screen flickered to life, but there was no recognizable image. Just a grainy black and white shot of a massive dark shape sitting in the mouth of the Chesapeake. No hull numbers. No national insignia. Just a void in the water where a ship should be. Thorne reached for the red phone to call the Kremlin, then London, then Beijing. Every line was met with the same thing, a recording in 5 languages stating that the subscriber is no longer part of the global network. As the sun began to peek over the Atlantic, the American people saw what the sensors couldn't. Off the coast of New York City and the beaches of Florida, massive carriers emerged from the morning mist. They were obsidian black so deep it seemed to pull the light out of the sky. They weren't hiding anymore. They flew a single banner from their masts, a heavy black cloth with white lettering that looked like a jagged scar, for world justice. There were no names on the ships, no HMS or USS, were the ghosts of 1,000 years of history coming back to collect a debt. People stood on the boardwalks in silence, cell phones raised to record the end of an era. The Black Fleet didn't fire on the civilians. They just sat there, an iron wall between America and the rest of the world. The president, desperate to show strength, ordered a counterstrike. "I want those black ships at the bottom of the ocean by noon," he screamed. He ordered the remaining F-35s that could still fly manually to engage. But as the jets screamed off the runways of the few remaining functional bases, they were met by the swarm. Thousands of small black drones the size of birds rose from the Black Fleet. They didn't use missiles. They simply flew into the engine intakes of the American jets. It was a suicide mission on a massive scale. Within 20 minutes, the pride of the American Air Force was falling in pieces into the waves. The Black Flag Nation hadn't just defeated the American military. They had made it look obsolete. The realization began to sink in at the Pentagon. America was no longer a player. It was a target. The line went dead. Again, I slammed the receiver down, the plastic cracking under the pressure. It was the 5th call. Paris, Berlin, London, Tokyo, Moscow, nothing. Just an endless, echoing silence on the other end. My chief of staff, General Miller, stood stiffly by the window, his reflection a grim mask in the reinforced glass of the Oval Office. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was written all over his face, in the tight set of his jaw and the deep furrows of his brow. "They've cut us off, haven't they?" I said, the words feeling like gravel in my mouth. Miller turned, his gaze heavy. "Completely, Mr. President. SATCOM confirms it. Every friendly nation has gone dark on our channels. It's a coordinated blackout. And the borders sealed. Canada and Mexico have mobilized their armies. Not for an invasion, sir. For containment. Our own satellites show a naval blockade forming. NATO ships, sir. Our allies. They're boxing us in." I sank into my chair, the leather groaning in protest. Quarantined. The word felt alien, absurd. The United States of America. A pariah state overnight. It didn't make sense. They hadn't launched any missiles, hadn't declared any war. What could possibly justify this? Trade? I asked, already knowing the answer. Halted Miller confirmed. The port of Los Angeles is a ghost town. Ships are turning back mid-ocean. The global supply chain. No, it's not just disrupted, sir. It's been severed. Clean cut. The implications crash down on me like a tidal wave. Food, medicine, fuel, electronics. Everything we relied on from the outside world was gone. Panic wouldn't just set in, it would explode. Stock market would evaporate. Riots would tear through cities within a week. We were a nation on a timer, and the clock had just started ticking. Why, General? Give me something. Miller slid a tablet across the polished surface of the resolute desk. On the screen was a single image. A microscopic view of a cell, misshapen and grotesque, with an unfamiliar protein spike. This was flagged by the CDC this morning, sir, from a sample in Chicago. They're calling it the Chimera strain. It's airborne, highly contagious, and it rewrites genetic code. The incubation period is unknown. The fatality rate is unknown. The world isn't attacking us, Mr. President. They're terrified of us, Chicago. A chill snaked up my spine. The first reports had been dismissed as a localized flu outbreak. How could we have been so blind? We weren't the victims of a conspiracy. We were the source of a plague. They think we're a leper colony, I whispered, the horror of it all settling in my gut. Yes, sir, Miller said, his voice flat. And they're willing to let us die to ensure it doesn't spread. For a moment, the immense weight of it all threatened to crush me. 250 years of history, of leadership, of being the bedrock of the modern world, erased in a single morning. We were alone, abandoned by the very world we had helped build. Despair was a luxury I couldn't afford. Fear was a traitor I couldn't harbor. My nation was looking to me. They needed a leader, not a victim. They needed a fighter. I stood up, my back straightening. Fear was still there, a cold, not inside me, but something else was rising to meet it. Defiance, hot, furious anger. They had left us for dead. They had sentenced 330 million souls to a slow, agonizing demise without a trial, without a warning. They had forgotten who we were. It was my job to remind them. Get the press secretary, I commanded, my voice ringing with a newfound resolve. Tell the networks I'm addressing the nation. In 1 hour, Miller's eyes widened slightly. Sir, what will you tell them? The truth will cause mass hysteria. The truth is all we have left, General, I retorted. But it's how you frame the truth that matters. They expect us to panic. They expect us to collapse. They expect us to lie down and die quietly. We will do none of those things. An hour later, I stood before the cameras in the East Room. The teleprompter was blank. I had refused a prepared speech. This had to come from the heart, from the gut. The red light blinked on, and I looked directly into the lens. Imagining the faces of my countrymen and women staring back from their living rooms, their bars, their hospital beds. My fellow Americans, I began, my voice steady and clear. This morning, we woke up to a world that had turned its back on us. Our lines of communication have been cut. Our borders have been sealed. The lifelines of trade that connect us to the globe have been severed. The nations we called our friends have quarantined us, treating us not as partners, but as a plague to be contained. They have done this out of fear. A new sickness has emerged within our borders, and in their terror, they have chosen to abandon us. They have sentenced this great nation to wither and die in isolation. They are waiting for us to panic. They're waiting for our society to crumble. They're waiting for the United States of America to become a footnote in the history books. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a powerful, resonant tone. I am here to tell you tonight, we will not grant them their wish. We will not be defined by the fear of others. We will be defined by our own courage. We're a nation of pioneers, of innovators, of survivors. We crossed oceans in wooden ships. We settled a continent. We faced down tyrants and built a new world. We have stared into the abyss of civil war, of economic collapse, of world wars. And each and every time, we have emerged stronger, more united, and more resolved. This challenge is no different. They have cut us off from their supply chains, and we will innovate our own. Our farms will feed our people. Our factories will build what we need. Our scientists, the best in the world, will not rest until they have found a cure for this disease. They have locked us in, and we will turn this quarantine into a crucible. A crucible where our spirit is tested, our ingenuity is forged, and our unity is solidified. Look at your neighbor. They're not your competitor for the last can of food. They are your brother, your sister, your fellow American. We will share what we have. We will support the weak. We will protect the vulnerable. The old divisions of politics and class are meaningless now. We are all Americans, standing together against a world that has forsaken us. Let the world watch. Let them see what happens when you corner a lion. You do not get a whimper. You get a roar. This is not the end of the American story. This is the start of our most courageous chapter. We will endure. We will overcome. And when we emerge from this trial, and we will emerge, we will do so not as a victim, but as a testament to the unconquerable spirit of a free people. So tonight, let's get to work. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America. The red light went out. Silence filled the room, but I could already hear it, a faint rumble from 1,000 miles away. No, it was the sound of a nation waking up. It's the sound of a lion ready to roar. He appealed to the United Nations, calling for an emergency session to condemn this unprovoked aggression. But as he spoke, the feed was being jammed. In most American homes, his face was replaced by a slow-scrolling list of the nations Thorne had bombed over the last 4 years, followed by a simple white-on-black text. The cost of unilateralism. The world wasn't just ignoring him. They were fact-checking his downfall in real time. Then came the sunset. For 2 centuries, Americans viewed the night as a time for leisure, for the bright lights of the city, for the security of a well-lit home. But on this Tuesday, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a new kind of darkness settled in. The president had declared a national emergency, ordering all non-essential power to be cut to save fuel for the military. The great American megalopolis, the corridor from Boston to D.C., went pitch black. No streetlights, no billboards. Just the sound of the wind and the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the Black Fleet sitting just off the coast, their obsidian hulls invisible in the dark. It was the first night of the siege, and for millions of Americans, the realization was finally dawning. They were completely, utterly alone. The clock struck midnight on the first night of the blackout, in the Hamptons, where the architects of the president's judicial overreach were hiding in their seaside estates. The air suddenly hummed. It wasn't the scream of a jet. It was a low, vibrating thrum that shook the fine china in the cupboards. There were no sirens, no warning, just a series of blindingly white flashes that turned the Atlantic coast into high noon for a fraction of a second. When the light faded, the mansions of the power brokers were gazed with surgical precision by high-altitude kinetic rods. The Black Flag Nation wasn't interested in the barracks of the poor. They were hunting the boardrooms of the rich. By 2 a.m., the fire moved west. Hollywood, the great engine of American soft power, became the next target. The iconic sign on the hill wasn't blown up. It was simply melted into the scrubland by a concentrated energy beam. The major studios, the server farms that held the world's entertainment, and the gated communities of the elite were systematically dismantled from 5 miles up. The message was clear. If you lived in a zip code that funded the President's wars, you were on the manifest. The rest of the city watched from the shadows of the valley, realizing that the Black Flag knew exactly who was responsible for the nation's hubris. They weren't fighting a country. They were performing an audit of its soul. Inside the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, President Thorne lost his mind. "If they want to play God, let's show them the devil," he whispered. Overriding the objections of his Joint Chiefs, he used a specialized executive override code to bypass the traditional launch sequence. He didn't target the black ships. He targeted the capital cities of the coalition he suspected was behind them. He ordered a volley of Minuteman III missiles to be launched from the silos in North Dakota. He wanted to burn the world down with him. The silos opened. The fire roared. The missiles cleared the atmosphere, heading for the poles. Then, the impossible happened. At the peak of their trajectory, the missiles didn't separate. They didn't deploy their decoys. Instead, every single one of them performed a synchronized aerodynamic pirouette in the vacuum of space. On the radar screens at NORAD, the technicians watched in horror as the telemetry changed. The destination wasn't Moscow or Beijing anymore. The missiles were banking 180 degrees, screaming back down toward the North American continent at Mach 23. The Black Flag Nation hadn't just jammed the signal. They had rewritten the missile's DNA in mid-flight. They were coming for Chicago. They were coming for Houston. Thorne had no choice. To save his own cities from his own madness, he had to trigger the remote command to struck codes. For 10 minutes, the night sky over the Midwest was filled with the silent, radioactive glitter of billions of dollars of American hardware being detonated by its own hand. The president fell back into his chair, the weight of the realization finally crushing him. He wasn't just outgunned, he was being toyed with. The Black Flag Nation had turned his sword into a boomerang. As the sun began to rise on the second day, the American people didn't look to the White House for protection anymore. They looked at it with a growing, terrifying suspicion. In the old world, sunset was a transition to leisure. In the new America, Robert Hart describes it as a curtain of dread. As the sun dipped below the horizon on day 3, the entire continent went silent. No one spoke above a whisper. The new sunset meant the return of the low-frequency hum of the Black Fleet. Americans began to live like burrowing animals. They shuttered windows with plywood and hung heavy blankets to hide any flicker of candlelight. They knew now that the Black Flag Nation was uninterested in the infrastructure of the people. The water plants and the power lines were mostly intact, but they were hunting the movement. If a city stayed bright, it was a target. Darkness became the only form of prayer left. By the end of the first week, the pantry of the world was empty. Robert Hart paints a bleak picture of the American Midwest. The silos were full of grain, but there was no fuel to move the trucks, and the GPS-guided rail systems were still bricked. The American diet suddenly contracted to whatever was grown within 50 miles. In the cities, the sound of the grocery store shutters slamming shut for the last time became the new national anthem. The executive mandate had promised total security. But as the citizens stood in bread lines, they realized that the president's judicial power could unconjure an orange from a closed border or a gallon of gas from a dead pipeline. The terror had a hierarchy. Because the Black Flag Nation had started by leveling the Hamptons and the Hollywood Hills, the American elite panicked. A massive exodus began. Private jets were useless. Anything in the air that didn't have a black flag transponder was instantly swarmed by drones. The billionaires tried to flee in armored convoys to their doomsday ranches in Montana and Wyoming. But the Black Flag Nation was surgical. Hart describes the trail of broken crowns. Hundreds of luxury SUVs abandoned on the interstates, out of gas, their occupants fleeing into the woods on foot. They found that their money was just paper in a world where the only currency was world justice. Key Largo wasn't just bombed, it was removed from the map. In a single night, the Black Flag Nation sent a message to the political donors who had funded the president's circumvention of the UN. A series of orbital kinetic strikes, rods from God, hit the exclusive resorts and private islands. There were no radioactive clouds, just the sheer force of physics hitting the Earth at Mach 10. The impact was felt as far away as Miami. When the sun rose, the coral reefs remained, but the symbols of the untouchable class were craters filled with seawater. It was the first time the American public felt a dark, twisted sense of relief. For once, the poor weren't the ones dying for a politician's ego. The most effective weapon of the Black Flag Nation wasn't the bombs, it was the silence. They never issued a manifesto. They never showed a face. They never landed a single soldier on American soil. This created a vacuum that the American mind filled with monsters. Robert Hart describes the Great Suspicion. Neighbors began to eye each other, wondering if the person next door was a world justice sleeper agent. The president's propaganda machines tried to blame foreign terrorists, but the people weren't buying it. You don't get this kind of precision from a cave in the desert. This was the entire world turning its back on them. The paranoia wasn't about who the enemy was. It was about the realization that America had become the world's villain. The United Nations headquarters in New York became a tomb. The American envoy, a man used to commanding the floor, walked into the General Assembly on day 10. He prepared a speech about sovereignty and illegal aggression. But as he approached the podium, the room began to drain. One by one, the ambassadors of the world from the smallest island nations to the largest continental powers stood up in a synchronized, silent exit. There were no shouts of order. There was no gavel. It's just the squeak of leather chairs and the heavy thud of the doors closing. The American envoy was left speaking into a dead microphone to a room of empty seats. The world hadn't just stopped listening. They had deleted the American frequency. At 8 p.m., every screen in America that still had a battery or a generator flickered. It wasn't the president. It was a single, static-free broadcast from the Black Flag Nation. There was no face, just the black banner with white text. A voice, modulated and calm, spoke in a mid-Atlantic accent that belonged to no specific country. We do not want your land. You want your compliance with the world. You have been a rogue element for too long. Your president has used your laws to break ours. We are not here to conquer. We are here to correct. The broadcast lasted exactly 60 seconds. Then the screens went black again. It was the first time the enemy had spoken, and they sounded more like a judge than a general. While the elites were being vaporized in Key Largo, the working class was starving in the heartland. In Kansas and Nebraska, the breadbasket of the world was rotting. The president had ordered the army to seize all grain for strategic reserves, military code for feeding the bunkers. Robert Hart describes the wheat field riots. Farmers, armed with hunting rifles and sitting on tractors, faced off against National Guard units. For the first time, American soldiers were ordered to fire on American farmers to protect the president's food supply. The videos, captured on grainy flip phones and smuggled out via local mesh networks, did more damage to the government than any black flag bomb ever could. The executive mandate was now eating its own. The shift started in a small town called Brattleboro, Vermont. The local sheriff and the town council, tired of the nighttime terror and the lack of medicine, made a radical choice. They took a white bedsheet and a can of black spray paint. They painted the For World Justice logo on the roof of the town hall and the local hospital. That night, for the first time in 2 weeks, the low-frequency hum of the Black Fleet bypassed Brattleboro. The town sat in a pool of moonlight, untouched, while a military base 30 miles away was leveled. The news spread like wildfire. If you submit to the black flag, the sky stops screaming. This was the Vermont miracle, the discovery that the black flag was uninterested in the American people, only the American government. President Thorne reacted with the only tool he had left: rage. From his bunker, he issued the Traitor Proclamation, declaring that any municipality or state that displayed the black flag insignia would be treated as an enemy combatant. He ordered the Air Force to bomb Brattleboro as an example. But the pilots refused to take off. They looked at the satellite feeds of their own families painting black flags on their roofs to stay safe. The chain of command didn't just break, it dissolved. The president was now a commander with no army, a judge with no court, and a man whose only remaining power was the air in his own lungs. President Thorne's Traitor Proclamation was meant to instill fear, but it backfired with historical finality. In the state houses of Montpelier and Concord, governors looked at the smoking ruins of military bases and then at the peaceful, untouched towns flying the black flag. They realized that the president was asking them to die for a sovereignty that only served his ego. By noon, the governor of Vermont went on a local radio frequency. The only thing still working, and officially invited the Black Flag Nation to oversee the security and welfare of the state. It wasn't a surrender to a foreign power. It was a divorce from a domestic one. The red line wasn't between America and the world anymore. It was between the people in Washington. The Black Flag Nation responded to the Vermont miracle with the harvest. They didn't land troops, and they didn't send food aid. Instead, they used their surgical air power to carve out safe corridors. By nightfall, 4,000 Marines had walked off the base. They didn't defect to the Black Flag. They just went home. They took their rifles to protect their own neighborhoods. Robert Hart narrates this as the quiet coup. There were no gunfights at the gates, just the sound of thousands of boots marching away from a war that no longer had a purpose. Hart takes a moment to dive into the terrifying brilliance of the Black Flag's silence. For 2 weeks, there had been no demands for money, no demands for land, no political manifestos. This lack of wants made them impossible to negotiate with. Can't bribe a ghost. Can't compromise with a judge who won't tell you the sentence. This psychological void created a new kind of American citizen. One who stopped caring about the republic and started caring about the balance. The propaganda of the past, the city on a hill, was being replaced by the reality of the Black Mirror. They were being forced to look at what they had allowed their government to become. Then the winter hit. The executive mandate had exhausted the national strategic oil reserves in the first week as failed counterattacks. Without international trade, The heating oil for the Northeast simply didn't exist. The power grid, already flickering from cyber attacks, finally gave up. Robert Hart describes the cold grid as the final nail. In the darkness of a frozen Minneapolis and a snow-blind New York, the only warmth came from the realization that the Black Flag nation wasn't the one who had turned off the heat. Their own president had gambled it away on a strike in a country most of them couldn't find on a map. The American people were cold, they were hungry, and they were finally dangerously done. President Thorne retreats to the Cheyenne Mountain complex. He is surrounded by gold-plated fixtures and 20-foot thick granite, yet he is the most isolated man on earth. His only company is a handful of loyalists, and the glowing screens showing a nation painting itself black. A massive black flag fleet led by a flagship 4 times the size of a standard carrier drops. Anchor in the Hudson River, they don't fire, they don't land. They simply sit within sight of the Statue of Liberty, an obsidian wall of judgment. In a grassroots movement that defies the government's traitor proclamation, school children across the Midwest begin painting black banners on their playgrounds. They realize the black flag is a shield. If the flag is there, the bombs stay in the tubes. Thorne, seeing the black flag in the Hudson, orders a tactical nuclear strike on his own territorial waters. He authorizes Project Archangel, a scorched earth protocol to wipe out the fleet in New York City with it. In the silos of Wyoming and Montana, the officers turn their keys, but the computers don't respond. The black flag's cyber dominance is total. The missiles remain in the ground. The military has officially chosen the world over their president. The end doesn't come from the black flag. It comes from the Secret Service. Inside the bunker, the agents realize Thorne is a clear and present danger to the existence of the continent. They disarm him in the middle of a screaming fit. At the Peace Arch border crossing in Washington state, Thorne is handed over to a UN tribunal. He is stripped of his title and led away in zip ties. The American presidency, for all intents and purposes, ends at that moment. The unconditional silence. America surrenders. There are no terms. There is no negotiation. The Black Flag Nation finally issues its response. The Republic is dissolved. The experiment is over. Prepare for the Protectorate. The London Protocol. In a shock to the global system, the UN determines that the American people cannot be trusted with self-governance after allowing Thorne's rise. To ensure stability, they look to the mother country. The Western Atlantic Protectorate, the United States, is officially renamed. The borders remain closed. But the Black Blockade begins to allow humanitarian ships through, all flying the Union Jack alongside the Black Flag. The UK Parliament, under UN mandate, accepts the royal leadership of the former American colonies. It is the Great Reversal of 1776. A British Governor-General is installed, not in D.C., but in Philadelphia, the birthplace of the nation, as a symbolic finality. The Constitution is moved to a museum in London. The Black Flag Nation does not leave. They remain in the harbors, becoming the autonomous enforcers. They are the shadow behind the British throne, ensuring that the new laws are followed. Robert Hart narrates the dismantling of American democracy. Voting booths are removed. Local councils are replaced by crown-appointed magistrates. The people, exhausted by war and hunger, largely offer no resistance. For the first time in months, the grid is fully restored. But the news on the television isn't American, is the BBC, broadcasting from London, detailing the new civility laws. Peace has a price. America is stripped of its heavy industry. The nation is returned to an agrarian and service-based economy. Everything produced is audited by the UN. A small group of new patriots gathers in the mountains of West Virginia, clutching old copies of the Bill of Rights. They plan a raid on a local armory. They never get the chance. The Black Flag Nation, using satellite-based thermal imaging, identifies the heat signatures of the gathering. A single kinetic pin is dropped from orbit. The mountain peak vanishes. The message is heard. Descent is no longer an option. The Black Flag issues a final ultimatum. We do not wish to conquer you, but we will erase you. Seek a second revolution, and we will not target your wealthy. We will target the ground beneath your feet. The American people, broken by the precision of the justice they once exported, settle into their new roles. The streets are safe, the food is consistent, and the silence is absolute. British educators arrived to restructure American history books. The revolution is renamed the Great Colonial Divergence. The Black Fleet begins to move back into the Atlantic, but they leave behind sentinels automated. Black towers in every major city that hum with the same terrifying frequency. Robert Hart speaks to the irony of history. A nation born from attacks on tea has returned to the crown because it could uncontrol its own thirst for power. World justice has been served. The rogue has been tamed. The world is one. The black flag fades from the screens, replaced by the stoic face of the new Governor General. The story ends with a slow, sweeping narrative over a darkened, quiet America. The skyscrapers of New York fly the Union Jack. The black sentinels hum in the parks. The fall of a nation is complete, replaced by the cold, orderly peace of a world that refused to be bullied anymore. Imagine a world where the United States as we know it simply ceased to exist. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, grinding halt. This isn't the plot of a blockbuster movie. It's the story of the Great Collapse and the birth of something entirely new from its ashes. It all began with what historians now call the Long Silence. For 3 full days in the autumn of 2038, all official communication from Washington, D.C. just stopped. No presidential addresses, no congressional sessions, no Supreme Court rulings. The nation held its breath, glued to screens that showed nothing but static from the Capitol. At first, people thought it was a cyber attack, a massive technical glitch. But as days turned into weeks, a chilling reality began to sink in. The federal government had effectively dissolved. Decades of political polarization, economic instability, and social fragmentation had finally reached their breaking point. The complex machinery of the state had ground to a halt, not from an external enemy, but from internal decay. State governments suddenly cut off from federal funding and direction were thrown into chaos. Some governors declared martial law, others tried to form regional alliances, but most simply struggled to maintain basic services. The supply chains, once the lifeblood of the nation, fractured. Grocery store shelves went bare, power grids flickered and died, and the US dollar became little more than printed paper. It was a time of fear and uncertainty. Communities turned inward, with neighborhoods barricading themselves, trusting no one. But amidst this nationwide despair, a flicker of hope ignited in the Green Mountains of Vermont. This small, fiercely independent state had always been a little different. Its people, known for their self-reliance and strong community bonds, were uniquely prepared for a crisis of this magnitude. While other states were descending into chaos, Vermonters were already organizing. They reactivated their old town meeting traditions, a form of direct democracy that had existed since colonial times. In town halls and school gymnasiums across the state, ordinary people, farmers, teachers, mechanics, and small business owners gathered to solve their own problems. They organized local militias for security, not to control people, but to protect them. They created barter networks, trading maple syrup for medical supplies, and firewood for engineering expertise. Farmers shared their harvests, and retired electricians worked tirelessly to keep the local power grids running. They weren't waiting for a savior, they were saving themselves. This grassroots movement became known as the Vermont Miracle. It wasn't led by a single charismatic figure, but by the collective will of its people. Their guiding principle was simple: radical localism. Decisions were made by those who would be affected by them. Power wasn't centralized, it was distributed among the communities. Word of the Vermont Miracle began to spread, carried by ham radio operators and brave couriers traveling the broken roads. People in neighboring states, tired of the chaos and the failed attempts by warlords and would-be tyrants to seize power, looked to Vermont not as a conqueror, but as an example. Communities in New Hampshire, Maine, and parts of New York and Massachusetts began to adopt the Vermont model. They sent delegates not to a capital, but to a network of equals. They weren't being annexed. They were choosing to join a new kind of union, a federation built from the ground up. This growing alliance of self-governing communities needed a name, a symbol. They chose the black flag. Now, I know what you're thinking. Historically, the black flag has been associated with pirates or anarchy in the sense of chaos. But they reclaimed it. For them, The black flag represented a rejection of all the old flags and the failed states they stood for. It was a symbol of a fresh start, a clean slate. It meant that all people were equal under this banner, with no pre-existing hierarchies. The Black Flag Nation was born. It wasn't a nation in the traditional sense, with a monolithic central government. It was a decentralized confederation of free towns and regions, united by a common constitution that enshrined individual liberty, direct democracy, and mutual aid. The Black Flag Constitution was a revolutionary document. Its primary author was a former law professor from Vermont named Anya Sharma, but it was debated and ratified in hundreds of town meetings. Its core tenet was the principle of subsidiarity, that matters ought to be handled by the smallest, lowest, or least centralized competent authority. A national council existed, but its powers were strictly limited to coordinating defense, managing continent-wide infrastructure, and diplomacy. Most power resided at the local level. There was no income tax, no federal police force. Instead, communities contributed to the common defense and infrastructure projects based on their population and resources, a system they called the Pact of Contribution. Justice was administered locally, focusing on restoration and reconciliation rather than punishment. They pioneered a system where communities could freely join or leave the nation, a concept they called voluntary association. Of course, the rise of the Black Flag Nation wasn't without its challenges. Remnants of the old U.S. military, now operating as independent factions, saw this new entity as a rebellion. They tried to restore order, but they found that conquering the Black Flag Nation was like trying to punch water. There was no central head to cut off. To invade the Black Flag Nation was to invade thousands of fiercely independent, self-defending towns, all united in their desire to be left alone. The old-world military tactics of shock and awe were useless against a decentralized network of determined citizens defending their homes. After a series of costly failures, most of the old factions collapsed or were absorbed into the new way of life. Today, the Black Flag Nation covers most of what was once the northeastern United States. It's a patchwork of vibrant, diverse, and self-reliant communities. Some are agrarian, some are focused on advanced manufacturing, others are hubs of art and technology. They trade freely with each other and with the other nations that have emerged from the Great Collapse. Their society isn't a utopia. They have problems, disputes, and struggles, but they face them directly, through debate and consensus, not through dictates from a distant capital. They prove that a society can function and even thrive without a massive top-down state. They replaced the pyramid of power with a network of cooperation. The Vermont miracle wasn't just about survival, it was about building something better. It's a testament to the idea that when old systems fail, the most powerful force for change isn't a new government, but the resilient spirit of people coming together to build their own future on their own terms. This story serves as a powerful thought experiment, challenges our assumptions about what a nation has to be, and reminds us of the power that lies within our own communities. If you found this story thought-provoking, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more explorations of history, both real and imagined. Till next time, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe for the next chapter in this story.
Hey, you heard about the good news? Y'all sleeping on me, huh? Had a good snooze. Wake up, wake up. We about to get this paper. Money never made me. Made me do something, nah, can't make me. Even if the money low can't pay me. Even if the money low can't play me.